Welcome to the Sales Beat podcast, where we explore sales intelligence in fast-moving consumer goods and how you can deliver against your sales goals. I am Veena Giridhar, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of SalesBeat, an AI-driven platform eliminating lost sales in fast-moving consumer goods sector due to understocking and overstocking. As mentioned in our last podcast, today we welcome a guest, Matthew Selbie from Oberon3. Matt is from the UK and has 20 years of international experience in the energy, retail, and software sectors. He is currently the co-founder and president of Oberon3 and based out of the US. Oberon3 is a digital comment card enabling on-the-spot actionable feedback delivered as a SaaS product. Matt spent most of his career in the energy sector in the UK, France, South Africa, Venezuela, Malaysia, and in the US, so pretty international. After working for a few years with BP, Matt moved to Phillips 66. He was later the managing director for ConocoPhillips in Malaysia and then loyalty and brands manager for ConocoPhillips in the US. Knowing how important customer loyalty and repeat sales is for businesses, Matt started Oberon3 to help increase customer retention rates for all businesses. Their product is called Opiniata. Opiniata is a digital comment card that provides a customer feedback and recovery platform for brick and mortar businesses. The digital comment card system captures on-the-spot ratings, comments, and feedback from real customers and consumers using their own mobile phone. And this is done at any time throughout their experience, and then tracks the issues until they are solved by the business. This closed-loop feedback process means the business can respond before unhappy customers or consumers, for that matter, take their business elsewhere. Or worse, take their friends with them. Let's welcome Matthew. So Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for making time to come on the SalesBeat podcast. It's great to have you here.
It's wonderful, and many, many thanks for inviting me. It's great to chat.
Quick question, Opiniata, did I pronounce that right?
You did, and you get a gold star for that. I'm going to give you a good write-up on Yelp.
Thanks. And can you tell our listeners a bit about Opiniata and what you guys do?
Sure. So the company is called Oberon3. Oberon3 because I had Oberon 1 and Oberon 2, and being the great marketer, I couldn't think of a good name for a third company, so we called Oberon 3. And we called the technology Opiniata because it's based on to opine, to give your opinion. So what Opiniata is, it's a technology that's delivered as SaaS, it's a software as a service, that's effectively a digital comment card. It's a digital comment card that we provide to almost any out-of-home, that is brick and mortar business, that does three things. It allows feedback to be given by real customers at the point of consumption. So when they are experiencing the brand, consuming the service, it collects their feedback, it analyzes their feedback, and that really is the easy bit. But then if the feedback is negative, if Veena is unhappy because the queue's too long, the soup's too cold, the visit experience hasn't been good, it alerts the business in real time whilst Veena is still there, and therefore allows Veena to do two things. One, the business can communicate with Veena directly if she gives her permission, and it allows the business to take action. And in doing so, we attack this golden statistic of 95% of all businesses collecting feedback, but 10% taking any action. So we allow real-time, closed-loop, actionable feedback that improves retention and at the same time preserves, or rather stops, the brand exposure through Veena, the unhappy customer, not only defecting, but writing to her friends on Yelp for all the world to see with insubstantiated, open-ended, hard to analyze text 3 days after the event.
Got it. And what got you to start this?
Well, a number of different things. The business I was in the oil business for many, many years.
Yes.
And one of the metrics in the oil business, particularly the downstream side and particularly gas stations, convenience stores, all of that good stuff, is that it has a double-digit defection rate. So I don't know about your business, Veena, but if I had and incurred a double-digit defection rate, I'd be throwing myself off a cliff because it would be untenable. And yet, many types of industries, many types of brands in this country have an appalling defection rate because they don't really understand what's driving a negative experience. And even if they did, they don't have a mechanism to take any corrective action. So prompt number one was the realization that many verticals, including that particular one, had enormous defection rates. And then the second one is I'll tell you a little secret. Well, it's not such a little secret. Is I ride a motorcycle, and when I bought this motorcycle and I'm not going to reveal the brand because that would be disastrous. But when I bought this bike, I was called, maybe a month later from a third party. And this third party said, we want to ask you a few questions about the motorcycle, which is all fine and good. And then they said, well, I want to ask you some questions about the transaction. Now, I don't know about you, Veena, but I can barely remember the names of my children. I certainly don't remember what I had for breakfast this morning. Right. And yet this third-party company is somehow expecting me to recall whether the guy that sold me the bike had a smile on his face or his name badge on. Yeah. And I thought, what a crock. This is just ludicrous. There has to be a better way, because asking me about an experience 4 weeks in the past is meaningless. What a waste of time. Complete and utter waste of time. And so it was those two things that said a well-known motorcycle brand in the US is exhibiting the most asinine behavior, coupled with industries in the States having double-digit defection rates. There has to be a better way. So that's the long, convoluted answer to say, well, we may as well deploy some technology to see whether we can fix this.
Got it. And I'm assuming you saw this across the countries that you worked with as well, because I saw that you have quite an international experience. You've worked in a lot of different countries, and this is not just a US specific problem. It exists across the world.
Yes. I mean, I don't know the data nearly as well outside of the States, but certainly in the UK, they have enormously high defection rates. I worked a little bit in South America and a little bit in Southeast Asia. So I would assume that they have the same. I mean, I just think this idea of not being able to understand and or react to negative feedback and negative experience is going to be global. So I would think so. And just to kind of raise it a bit here in the US, and I'm going to try, unfortunately, the data that I've got is much more US centric than anywhere else. You have industries where you would think they would be particularly sticky with high retention rates, but that isn't the case. Even in retail banking, where you deposit your checks and whatever else you do, also has a double-digit defection rate. Now, that's normally not full defection. Mm-hmm. It's not a binary thing where they're here today and gone tomorrow. It's usually a declining share of wallet. But again, I would say to you and your company, and perhaps those people who are going to be listening to this, can you afford over 10% of your customers leaving every year? That's the first question. And then the second one is, do you know how many people leave every year? At which point there's going to be the resounding noise of crickets in the background, because most of the businesses that we deal with don't know.
Yeah, especially when it comes to consumer-focused businesses where you're talking millions of people buying and potentially them losing 10 to 20% of their...
Right.
Especially e-commerce, physical stores when they walk in, because it's really hard to track who comes into your store, buys a product, is not happy with what they don't find in the store or their transaction experience in the store and just go away and not come back.
Well, and again, I think, unfortunately, many brands have a sort of a sense of self-confidence that is misplaced, because they seem to think that they know what's going on, and therefore they're probably solving the wrong problem. I mean, I'll give you another bad story.
Yep.
150 years ago, when I first came to the States, I was a waiter just to try and make ends meet. I was a very bad waiter, a terrible waiter, actually, when it came to it. But what I would do is, and what we were trained to do, is to come along and say, "Hi, Vina, how was the meal?" Now, 95% of all adults in the US will not complain face to face, will not do it. So I'm going to come up to Vina, and Vina could have, a blood clot in her soup. And you're going to say, "Oh, that's fine. The meal's good. The meal's good," because you're just not going to have that interaction. So I'm now going to go away thinking, "Hey, she loves it. She loves the blood clot in her soup or the fly in her soup." So there is a sort of sense of being misled because you're asking the wrong question at the wrong time and expecting the customer to be normal, rational, and communicative. None of those things work. So I think there's an accrual of poor assumptions with poor behavior, delivering poor metrics that aren't really attacking this retention problem. At the same time, they're being fed a line by highly paid marketing consultants saying, "Hey, go out there, buy this new tool," and acquisition is the only thing that matters.
Yeah. So just to add some context to that, I don't think that's a problem restricted to the US. I think people across the world are very reluctant to give face-to-face verbal feedback when asked. They prefer to say, "Everything is great. It's brilliant," rather than say, "There's something seriously wrong with whatever you gave me or whatever product you served me." It's just the whole face-to-face thing that doesn't work, I think.
It's and the whole thing is delusional because these same organizations also use ludicrous techniques to try, I suppose, to keep their finger on the pulse of customer sentiment. So one of our big bugbears, one of our big "you got to be kidding me's," is the reliance of organizations to social media to somehow be a proxy for accurate customer satisfaction data. Now, if ever there was an idea that should be banished to the graveyard of bad ideas, it's that one. So there's a series of things that go along here. And I think, again, I don't want to bore you or your audience with stats, but one of them here that almost took my breath away when I first heard of it was that 95% of all US companies collect customer feedback in some form, yet only 10% of them do anything with that feedback. Now, if that as a CEO doesn't want to, at which point you want to throw yourself off a cliff, I don't know what will, because there is a colossal amount of activity going on into this space of feedback, yet almost no action is being taken, which means no improvement, which means no ROI.
Got it. So tell us a little bit about how this works and how it helps solve this problem, how Opiniata works, that is.
Sure. So there's really three facets to it. The first is that it allows feedback data to be collected at the point of experience very easily. So let's assume we'll continue to use a restaurant or retail. It really doesn't matter. You walk into this business. It's a brick and mortar. We're not online. We're offline at a brick and mortar location. And you would see some signage. And the signage says, "We really want your feedback. Choose one of these 4 mechanisms to give feedback." And they just happen to be all associated with your cell phone. You can text, you can call, you can scan a QR code, or you can go to a website. And we're the only ones in the US that offer these 4 different mechanisms. And that underscores one of the principles of the business, which is make feedback on the terms of your customer. We see a lot of organizations broadcast requests for feedback all the time, to the extent there is a phenomena over here, and I'm sure in the same in the UK and India, which is called survey fatigue. So I was staying at a hotel maybe 3 months ago, and within the space of 2 hours got 4 requests. Now, give me a break. I am now so livid about you bombarding me with this meaningless gobbledygook that I'm going to give you a negative review just out of spite. So the first principle behind Opiniata is make it easy, make it convenient, and make it on their terms. So I mentioned that you've got these 4 different ways of giving feedback driven by signage.
Yeah.
We also try and extend that by saying, choose a language that you prefer. So here in the States, obviously there's a lot of Spanish spoken. Mm-hmm. So customers may be more comfortable giving feedback in their own mother tongue, so Spanish. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing is make it anonymous and make the ability to give their name optional. Yeah. So one of my pet peeves, amongst many that you'll hear me rant about today, is that a lot of organizations have no idea how to ask for feedback. So I was at a convenience store the other day, and I'm not going to mention any names, and there was a comment card on there. And of course, I now have a sort of affinity. I can sniff these things out. And you look at it, and the first 4 questions were, who are you? Give me your name. Where do you live? What's your zip code? And how old are you? Well, on your bike. Get on your bike. If you think I'm going to divulge this to some, whoever they happen to be, you got another thing coming. So why on earth does a business need this? So again, make it on their terms, make it easy with a device they own, make it convenient, and make it quick. So the other principle we have is that out-of-home feedback is not the same as giving an online survey where you've got a beer in one hand and the music playing in the background. Yeah. If feedback takes longer than 1.5 minutes in an out-of-home setting, the drop-off rate really starts to rise, which means that feedback has to be short and pithy. And one of the things, therefore, that the signage is likely to say is feedback. 6 questions takes less than 1 minute, 1.5 minutes. So you've now got almost a contract between the business and the customer to say, this is what we would like. This is how long it's going to take. And this is how you can give it to us. And that has a number of benefits because we're not claiming we're a market research company giving representative feedback, that is representative samples. Mm-hmm. What we're doing is saying, if you make it easy, then the bell curve of responses is going to mirror the population. So it's not just going to be the very happy or the very unhappy. If you're very happy, I could smash a chair over your head and you're still going to give me 5 out of 5. Yeah. And yet the unhappy are going to find fault no matter what. As my grandmother would say, she would say, well, these people could find a bone in a boiled egg. So it doesn't matter what you do. The ice isn't cold enough, the pillows aren't fluffy enough. So those facets, if you combine them, make the opportunity to give constructive feedback very easy, particularly if it's in the form of a short survey. And my other tip is, for crying out loud, do not have more than one open-ended question. So when you start to tax the guest, the customer, the shopper with more than one open-ended question, mm-hmm. it sort of blows their mind because they have to think about what they're going to say. Whereas if you say, please rate this 1 through 5, or please select from these 3 answers, it's much, much easier. Yeah. And the other problem that has, of course, is the other thing that we see is, and I know we're slightly going down a rabbit trail here, but let me rant for a bit, is we see far too many organizations, when they ask these open-ended questions, what's the meaning of life? Tell me about the service. They have no way of disentangling a word salad and actually making meaning from vocabulary. So if I said to you, please tell me about the service, you may say, oh, well, the service was fast. If you said, what's the service to me? I might say, well, it's friendly, or it's efficient, or something like that. Right. So anyway, the sum of all of those things is, if you get it right, you have an opportunity to get real life feedback. And if that feedback happens to be negative, then our tool also immediately sends an alert message to the right people, including those in store. They therefore know they've got a problem. And Veena, who's taking it, has the opportunity to give her name and contact details. So the holy grail here is that Veena's unhappy, but she has been wowed by the way that the feedback has been requested. So in the alert message, the business has the opportunity to contact Veena directly, and therefore prevent her defecting and preempt negative feedback going online, and ideally having an opportunity, because Veena has been so bowled over by this experience that it turns Veena from a prospective naysayer into maybe an acolyte, someone who is going around and actually sweet talking the brand.
Got it. Yes, that sounds absolutely brilliant, because we've seen, so one of the things we used to do early in our product development is we used to track consumers on Twitter, especially the ones who go into stores and don't see products on shelf. And
Right.
like you said, they rant about it, and usually have a few hundreds of thousands of others who join this rant and talk about their bad experiences. And it basically snowballs into something that's not pretty.
And you've got you've got some other issues as well. I mean, the first thing, as you know, is that Twitter, any of these social media platforms are not equally used. So you tend to find a polarization of opinions there. And some people like nothing else except just bitching and moaning and ranting. And that's the first problem. The second problem is you also have created an expectation that if you as a brand rely on social media as somehow keeping your finger on the pulse, however ridiculous that is, you've now created the expectation that you're going to do something about it. So what are you going to do? Are you going to get back to Twitter user Veena individually? I don't think so. And if you don't, now Veena is doubly irritated because nothing's been done.
Exactly.
And the third thing is, I don't want to bang on about it, but I may as well, which is unstructured feedback from Veena or from anywhere else is terribly difficult to analyze, because it's a word salad post the event, and it's very difficult to untangle that and make sense of it. And AI is not there yet. I don't think sentiment analysis is good enough to be able to untangle all of this. And remember that this Twitter stuff is generally given to a marketing department that's overworked. So you can now see some poorly underpaid, spotty undergraduate intern having to somehow sift through all of this negative stuff on Twitter. So you have this, it's a ludicrous proposition. So I hope organizations don't do that, or if they do, they supplement it with other tools to provide a bit more structure.
That's an interesting comment. So one of the things we see is that a lot of companies don't quite do enough to get direct feedback from consumers. So in terms of, let's say, supermarkets, convenience stores, retailers, as you've already mentioned, they do have a comment card, poorly done, but they still have something when consumers leave the store. But if we look at the specific sort of brand owners, they at the moment don't have anything specific that collects feedback directly from consumers. I've worked with some of these companies, and I've worked as a salesperson, and I've worked very closely with customer service as well. And I do not recall sending any of our customers a feedback form or a survey on how we did, or our customer service did, or even our supply chain team did. So can you shed a little bit of light on how your products could help the sector, and even shed light on the current supply chain constraints we are facing now with inflation, people changing the way they buy things, and how what you do could help companies solve these issues, as in maybe not solve supply chain issues, because that's a stretch, getting from feedback to supply chain, but definitely in terms of making sure the customer is happy, has a good experience with the brand, as well as the retailer that they go to.
No, that's very good. I mean, that's kind of the meaning of life question, but I'll break it down into a bit, and just let's just backtrack a bit. And your summary of the current environment is very, very good. So again, over here in the States, we have this sort of holy trinity of bad things going on. The first is you have this sort of release from COVID of folk who have been sitting on cash, dying to spend it on things to get back to normal, going to the movies, having a drink, going to the hotels and so on. So you've got this great demand going on, which is good, but expectations are higher now. So folk who have been reluctant to spend are out there with higher expectations.
Yeah.
That's the first problem. The second problem is you have high inflation rates here. So they're slightly lower than the UK, but I mean, they're over 9% here across the board. And as you know, within the CPI, there are things that are higher than that, and there are things that are lower than that.
Yeah.
But that drives a sense of canniness with the average consumer. They're looking not for a bargain, but they are going to go elsewhere if they're given half a chance. And that could be high prices, but it could be bad service. And the third thing that's going on here, the final sort of leg of the three-legged stool, is you've got this, whilst we have very low unemployment rates, actually less than 4% here, there is a huge shortage of staff.
Yes.
So you have a lot of people going out with higher expectations, higher prices, which means they're going to defect more quickly, and a business not having enough people to be able to fulfill that. So what that means, if your glass is half full, it means that a business that can outperform its competitors is going to get a lot more business because of these pushes to defect. If you get it wrong, it means your defection rate is going to increase. So that's the background, which means you really need to do two things. One is set expectations. And what we've seen a lot here from the smart companies is saying, hey guys, look, we're sorry that things are not quite as normal. There may be fewer things on the shelf. We know that's the case. The second thing they'll do is to say, we have fewer staff, so lines at the checkout may be longer. Lines to get access to people may be tougher. Mm-hmm. But by the way, we're going to ameliorate that by having a more responsive app, or we're going to have a chat function where you can chat directly to people. So that's what the smart people are doing. But it means that if you get it wrong, the outcome is going to be catastrophic for the business.
Yes.
And you can see that with higher defection rates already here in the States. So that's why it's so important. And so what we think is a better tool is to allow feedback to occur at the point of consumption at any point in the customer journey. And you mentioned, Veena, you mentioned retail. And as you know, retail is not just about picking something up and buying it. It's about a journey from, I think the boundary should be confined to the actual real estate. I don't believe this nonsense about, you go onto the website for 3 days and you figure out what you're going to do. I think maybe if you're buying a luxury brand, but for low impulse stuff, I don't believe that's the case still. But I do believe that the experience starts when you're parking your car, looking at the signage, looking at the stuff on the wall to say, that looks like a bargain, greeting by the staff, going to the bathroom, picking up a cup of coffee. Now, one of my issues to add to the many is that journey mapping seems to be one of those tools that is used by quite a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I think if there was ever a tool that's been badly sold by consultants, it's journey mapping. Because I think it's a really blunt instrument to try and articulate something that's actually relatively simple. But you do need to let your customers know they can give feedback at different points about different things within that journey. So, for example, you might want to have feedback outside to say, did you know that there's trash on the floor? Did you know there's trash overflowing? Did you know I've just tripped over a step? There's an oil spill, whatever it happens to be. So that's the first thing. Within the store, do you have an easy mechanism by which a customer, without this direct interaction, but is there an easy way that you can say you're out of stock? Or why don't you have this brand? Or why is the signage so poor? Or why do you not have X or Y? Or I saw that the promotional mnemonic at this particular store is way poorer than the one, your competitor down the road. And if they go, for example, to the restroom, are the restrooms clean? Are they out of toilet paper? So there's different things within that journey. And I often use the analogy of a backpack. You walk around and into this backpack are chips of experience, good experience, bad experience, good. And eventually you get weighed down with an aggregate of this experience across the journey. And so all we're saying is that there has to be an easy mechanism throughout this journey for shoppers, but also browsers, to give feedback about anything. And I mentioned browsers quite deliberately because not in the convenience store market so much, because that's really a destination. People go in there and they know they're going to buy cigarettes and beer and what have you. But you take a department store. I mean, my daughter can spend hours in a department store not buying anything. So you also want to make it easy for that browser to give feedback as well.
Yeah.
So that was a very long, convoluted answer to say, these are some of the pressures that we see in the market. We see that not enough is being done to generate feedback. We're not seeing enough being done to have feedback at different points. And then, of course, we're not seeing enough done to say, Veena says her favorite brand of sandwich or ketchup is out.
Yeah.
And we're certainly not seeing enough being done in real time by a business to help Veena in fulfilling whatever she wants to do. Rather, the brand, as you've just described, is waiting on Twitter, some other farcical social media platform, to somehow put the toothpaste back in the tube 3 days after Veena has complained. I'm mixing my metaphors here, but that's the doomsday scenario that we see too often.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm sure you've thought of is potentially doing a feedback form at the shelf when the consumer is browsing. Is there a way for this person to give immediate feedback to either the supermarket or convenience store or even the brand saying, hey, I'm looking for a Colgate toothpaste. I can't find it on shelf. But it's supposed to be here because I'm standing right in front of where it says Colgate and your price is on there and I can't find it.
So yes, I mean, product specific feedback, I think, is very interesting because, as you know, I mean, you mentioned the convenience store market, and this applies equally to the grocery store chain. Brands pay a huge amount in terms of slotting fees in order to stake out their territory.
Exactly. Yes.
And that's a double-edged sword. So the good news is there is a great opportunity to get brand recognition. And it's also a great opportunity to ask the more strategic question. So the one that you went down was, where the hell is it? Why can't I find my ketchup?
Yeah.
But you can also use this as the perfect time to ask Veena, and I'm going to use Veena as the poster child. Okay, Veena, what brought you into the store? So let's just say it's a bottle of water. What brand do you normally buy? Why would you buy this? What's the right price point? How did you find about the offer? What do you think about the promotional mnemonic? Should it be 2 for 1, 3 for 2, buy one and get a beach ball? I mean, it's a perfect opportunity to ask not only the operational stuff about, fast, friendly, clean, and safe, but much more about almost key driver analysis. And the other thing that we do is, because our tool's built on a full survey engine, you can now start to ask what we used to call vulnerability analysis, but others call key driver analysis. So let's just take your bottled water example. So Veena is at a convenience store, super thirsty on a hot day, because even in Portland it's hot.
Yes.
And she sees an opportunity to give feedback on the latest brand of water. So you can ask, in addition to why are you looking at this and what else do you normally buy, you can ask two things. You can ask, well, please rate the pricing of this bottle of water today, low to high. Second question is, how important is pricing to you when you select this water brand? So there's two questions about two different attributes on the same brand. And if you plot them on a 2x2 matrix, it's a real opportunity for the brand manager, in fact, the category manager, to understand what they're getting right or wrong. And also for the convenience store, in this case, to be able to say whether they are operating correctly. Because it might well turn out to be that pricing is not important for that particular brand, and they're focusing on the wrong thing. So relative to other tools where you might get that information, like exit interviews, particularly as they leave the store, focus groups, you've got a great opportunity when Veena is thinking about the product.
Yes.
Rather than asking Veena 3 days later when her children are screaming and, and she's not thirsty.
Yes,
you see
absolutely.
What I mean?
Yep, totally. And I think you made a great point about focus groups. I think a lot of the times focus groups are usually led to certain answers because of the questions they are asked.
Of course.
And it's like you said, they forget. And a lot of times they are hypothetical questions. And you place these questions in front of real life consumers at the point where they're actually buying these things or in store, which is basically a lot more real and insightful feedback than you could ever get from focus groups.
Yes, and I mean, I'm not a massive fan of focus groups unless it's being used as something much broader.
Yeah.
But focus group by themselves, because they're largely dependent upon the skill set of the moderator.
Exactly.
And I think, and clearly you've got 12 people around a table, and some of these people, I think, because they're selected, and they're going to be given, $100 worth of Starbucks or something, that they feel as though they've got to say something. So all manner of God knows what's going to come out of their mouth. So it's an artificial setting being run by someone who, may or may not be qualified, giving answers by people who may not be representative. So the whole thing it's geared, unless it's done really carefully, it's geared to a fake result.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you make an interesting point about the moderator and people around a table, because I've seen scenarios where there are teams around a table, one person starts off on one tangent and everyone else follows, even if you know that they have different opinions from the person who started off this conversation. There's the herd mentality coming in.
It completely. Nobody wants to fall out of line. Nobody wants to disagree. And to a certain extent, you're being paid to sing for your supper. You've got a nice, Starbucks in one hand, a big donut in the other, and in a cozy, warm room and you're being asked a load of inane questions about something that may or may not matter. Yeah. So I think focus groups are great, but they fall into the category of you better use these wisely. It's a bit like mystery shopping. Mystery shopping for me is one of those tools that has been so badly used that you have to be very cautious about how you use it. It has its place, but not as a singular answer to a feedback problem.
Got it. And I think I just want to go back to a specific comment you made earlier on, which is that you provide in-store, physical store opportunities for feedback. So it's less about giving consumers or customers the ability to provide feedback on e-commerce sites or when they're buying something online. It's all about the physical store feedback process. Can you shed a bit of light on why you selected physical stores for what you're doing versus e-commerce and the virtual space?
Sure. I mean, it's purely self-interest, Veena, which is there are many organizations that have much more sophisticated technology than ours, going online with very fancy algorithms, asking questions at different points in time. But that's web-only feedback, and web-only feedback in a comfortable environment. So Veena is sitting down with a cup of coffee or glass of wine in one hand, browsing Amazon. That's a very different experience to Veena with a kind of kid in tow trying to find what she wants to cook for supper at a store. So just going back to the opportunity, we didn't see anyone, certainly here in the States, that enabled real-time point of experience that couples the ability to collect data with the ability to analyze data, with the ability to alert the business, and then finally the ability to track the response of the business to any negative feedback. And I go back to this Gartner statistic that I gave you earlier on, the one about 95% and yet only 10% do anything with it.
Yeah.
We want to couple the collection of feedback data with an action. Because unless you take action, then again, why bother doing it? There is just no point in doing it. And so the fourth part of our tool tracks the performance of the business to take action. So now Veena is the CEO of a chain of 40 convenience stores. And these 40 convenience stores are run by whomever, franchisees, dealers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Veena wants to know that if any negative feedback comes in, prices are too high, the queues are too long, the restrooms are smelly, that someone somewhere is doing something about it. And so that's part of what we wanted to build that, again, is very different from an online e-commerce type survey that you teed up at the beginning of your question. So frankly, as good marketers or as bad marketers, you want to think about what is a gap in the market.
Yes.
And who's filling this. And, fortunately, it's a smaller space because it's a more difficult space.
Yes.
When you think about trying to get feedback using, 4 different mechanisms, 4 different languages, works on any phone, any browser. I mean, it's just quite technically, there's a lot of nuts and bolts in there.
Absolutely. And I think that's the reason I asked that question is because you're totally right. There's plenty of companies that do this in the e-commerce space. In fact, you could track what your consumer does or your customer does on your website and know how many of them come there and leave without buying anything. Mm-hmm. And then follow that up with questions asked later if they are signed up and are a loyalty card member or whatsoever. The interesting thing about what you mentioned is that this could provide physical stores with a competitive edge versus e-commerce if they actually do this well, because right now that's the struggle, the physical versus e-commerce space.
I agree. It could do. I think it could do because it allows this adjustment in real time for both positive experience. So it does a number of things. It does all of the data and the analytics in real time. So on a minute by minute basis how well you're doing, what the average satisfaction level is, stock outs and all that good stuff. So if you're on the ball, then you have an opportunity to adjust. The second thing is that it allows you to take action. And I'm going to beat that drum all day long because that's the bit that will keep you ahead of the guy down the road that doesn't. Because it's a very competitive space, just going back to your earlier question about, what are the differences now? And I'm saying high inflation and everything else. So it's not going to take much for somebody to defect. And you're probably aware more than anybody else, and certainly more than we are, that it isn't just price that's the key determinant of defection. It's service.
Yes.
What actually happens at some people call it the moment of truth, but call it what you want. Call it when, the rubber meets the road. We can throw these back and forth, but it's when it happens. So if you have an opportunity to fix it, then that really is a competitive edge. And the final thing that the tool does, it does immediate benchmarking. Actually, that you will chastise me for the incorrect use of that term. It's not external benchmarking, but it's rather internal leaderboarding. So if Veena, the CEO, has 40 locations, it automatically ranks those best to worst, because I'm assuming that you would want to raise the average in order to improve overall customer satisfaction. But I mean, what the challenges are as well. Amazon does a great job of selling everything from goldfish to canoes. So, the experience had better be good.
Yeah.
But this way allows you at least to take action.
That makes total sense. Can you shed a little bit of light? So we've been speaking about retailers, convenience stores, supermarkets, and that sort of experience. Which other sectors are you in at the moment?
Well, it's funnily enough, but the sectors that you mention we're just really starting to get into those. They're not a big part of our portfolio, and I'd love to say that they were, despite my background. We've done an appalling job at reaching those. And we sell a lot to the government, the US government. So various state agencies are very keen to get feedback on the performance of a citizen with the state. whether that be the Department of Motor Vehicles, where you get your driver's license. It might be Parks and Rec, so they want to understand what the experience is when you're in the outdoors. And we do a lot of work with the Department of Transportation. So government is a big one. The second one is the attractions market, so zoos, aquariums, and things like that. And that's very similar, Veena, to this journey idea that we spoke about in your retail example, which I say begins at the car park. A theme park, an attraction, is made up of a discrete set of profit centers. You know, I'm going to try and flog you an expensive burger and a nasty stuffed dinosaur, in addition to you going around and looking at the ride. So they're very keen on feedback throughout the journey, and they're the ones in particular that are scared stiff, absolutely scared witless by the defecting customer going online to a TripAdvisor or Yelp. So we sell a lot to them on the premise that we can preempt some of this negative feedback because we're providing an easy mechanism by which feedback can be given. And actually for that market, we have a chat function as well that allows this chat. And finally, and I know this is going to sound a bit funny, but we are now doing a lot with any organization with restrooms. So public restrooms over here, because of COVID in particular, have meant that attitudes by the general public to restrooms have changed. They think that standards should be higher because they're going to catch something from using a public restroom. And there were tools out there that relied on touch screens. You can touch a smiley face, but no one is going to touch a touch screen for obvious reasons in a public restroom. And so now we do a lot of work for any organization that has public restrooms. We provide a touchless, that's the buzzword now. If you say touchless to a facility manager, you've big thumbs up for that. You've got to use the right language. So we now provide this for many organizations, education through government as well. So we're in a number of different sectors because, as you can imagine, what I've described, this closed loop feedback process, it's universal. We're agnostic as to who we ask, what we ask. The mechanism is the same. So we're in different verticals as well.
That makes total sense. And yes, I've been to public restrooms, and been very reluctant to touch anything on there, especially after COVID. Like you said, even before COVID, I was very wary of touching anything in there. Whether it was a feedback, those buttons that tell them whether you're happy, not happy, you're okay. No way am I touching those things.
Well, and I've got a bit of a bugbear about those as well, because you're a smart lady and you run a very big company and so on. But in all of your experience, what exactly are you going to take away by someone pressing a button with a smiley face? What's the action that you're going to take as a result of that? I mean, sentiment analysis. Yeah, give me a break. So we think there is a better way to overcome some of this stuff that just happens to use the technology, and it's also it has no capital involved. So there's nothing that hits the balance sheet. There's no maintenance or anything else. So a typical experience over here, for example, if you drove along one of the state freeways and you stopped in at a rest area. So typically a rest area is where you walk the dog, go to the bathroom, buy a Coke or something. The DOTs, Department of Transportations, are getting feedback on are they safe? Did you see any maintenance issues? Is the cleanliness up to speed and so on? And all of that is fairly self-explanatory. But the bit that I haven't mentioned is over here, and maybe this is the same with some of the industries that you're in. The maintenance, janitorial, and cleaning are largely outsourced. They're outsourced to a third party. And so by measuring the performance of that third party against some standard, how long it takes to response, the quality of the response. The tool can also be used as part of a performance contract between the business and the provider and the citizen, of course. So it's got different uses. And Veena, I would love to say that we thought about this 10 years ago, but we didn't. This all happened quite organically with a lot of mistakes and somehow being at the right place at the right time. But that's what we do now.
Yeah, and I'm sure you listened to a lot of customer feedback, acted on it, and developed your business as you saw it.
I never listen to customer feedback. Yeah, no, we do. We rely on customer feedback. It's an interesting point you raise, because we rely on customer feedback almost in its entirety as the mechanism by which we fill up the hopper of features that we need to develop.
Yes.
So the chat feature that we did recently, we've now added different languages. All of these things were largely customer driven. But I throw that out there. I would say you've got to be very systematic. Who do you talk to? Do they have an agenda? Just be smart about it, because not all opinions are equal.
Exactly.
And so, but yes, they are our number one source of ideas, and they use the same tool to tell us how badly we're doing, if that is indeed the case. That, of course, Veena, is a very rare event, as you can imagine.
Got it. I have a question, probably one last question before we sign off, which is, what is the defection rate you see from disgruntled customers or consumers, for that matter?
It depends. It really does depend. So, and I'm going to try and be as precise as I can, and I'm not going to be as definitive as you would want me to be, and I'll do that for three reasons. One is, there are many businesses that don't know how to measure defection. So if you ask them that question, you're going to see the eyes wide open, and almost the words go over the top of their head, because they're just not going to know.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. The second thing, that the published metrics that are out there by the Gartners and the CX organizations, they're going to take an industry, which is obviously made up a basket of companies, and it's not going to be all of the companies. It's just going to be those that have got the systems in place to measure it. But we do see far too much double digit. So in the restaurant business, it's close to 20%. Now, that's a horrendous statistic.
Yes.
So that's the second one. And the third one, where it's my answer's not a good one, because it's not definitive enough. But many people think about defection as a binary example. Veena is a customer, and then tomorrow she's no longer a customer. But what's more typical is that that my share of Veena's wallet is going to decline. So, it's not a sort of pregnancy, you are or you aren't. It's much more of a decline over time, which again is a much harder thing to measure. And really the only way you can measure that, or the way that we try to measure it back 100 years ago when I was in that oil business, was through the credit card, because you can now see how much they spend using the credit card relative to what they did before. So the bad news is for you is that I've given you a terrible answer, because it's imprecise. What we do know is that it's not good, and we see far too many people with double digits. And when people come to us, they'll say, we're losing customers. But they don't know how much, they don't know for how long, and they don't know what to do about it. But at the same time, they'll continue to spend on ludicrous strategies, concocted God knows where, without even thinking about the basics. Is the store clean? Are the people friendly? Are the stocks as high as they need to be? So our big thing is, until you get that basic operational stuff right, it doesn't matter whether the strategy has been written by McKinsey and Co., you will fail.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we can help you do, we're not going to turn water into wine, but we will be able to give you some sense of how well you're doing. And that's a good start. So that was a great question, meandering answer, very, very lack of definition to it. And I apologize in advance for that.
No problem. But the takeaway that I got from it was it could potentially be double digits, or the highest point is double digits. And double digits is always a bad thing to happen with losing your customers or consumers. And my second takeaway from our conversation was that not only could these customers leave your business, but they could take their friends with them as well.
Yeah, and
that's harder to measure.
Well, and you've probably read as many studies about this as I have. I mean, there was this space tends to be full of hyperbole. So there was a book written a pretty bad book written, I mean, a few years ago, and the headline was, one customer gone tells $1,000. For fantastic byline, and it's going to, New York bestseller list. But really, dude, really 1,000 customers. The ripple effect is very difficult to measure because you really don't know how many people they're going to tell, and you really don't know, even if you were to, if I told Vina that I had a fly in my soup, well, Vina may not listen to me anyway. So it's a really difficult thing. You can probably measure how many people they tell. So the reach, I think, is probably fairly accurate. The change in behavior, really, really gray. But it's bad. Whatever it is bad. I mean, there's no good story out of this.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for being here, Matt. It's been a real pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. It's always good to chat about retention, acquisition, marketing, and putting the world to rights. But thank you very much indeed for having me. It's a great podcast, and I look forward to listening to many more.
Great. If you have any questions or comments on customer retention and how feedback relates to this, leave a comment here if you're watching on YouTube, and we'll address them in a future episode. If you are listening to this on Apple or Spotify, email me on vina@salespeed.co with any questions. If you're interested in learning more about Opiniata, check them out on opiniator.com, which is OPINIATOR.com. Thank you for listening.